Sounds good. Good evening. Welcome to the 6th INET Plenary Conference, and happy birthday, Billie Holiday, who turned 100 yesterday on April 7th. I thought it was fitting to start with her song, April in Paris. I never knew the charm of spring. I never met it face to face. I never knew my heart could sing. I never missed a warm embrace till April in Paris. Chestnuts in blossom, holiday tables under the trees. April in Paris. This is a feeling that no one can ever reprise. The Institute for New Economic Thinking focuses on ideas, new ideas and sound ideas that have ramifications for real challenges. Ideas where existing economic theory is unsatisfactory and at times provides harmful representations, as we experienced in the financial crisis of 2008. Sometimes economic theory is mute in the face of formidable challenges, and that's no better. We look for ideas where we can envision a way forward that goes beyond stale or mechanical paradigms and denigrates human beings, where wholehearted visions of society and its well-being can be brought to life. At our very first conference at the conclusion, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa spoke of 3 criteria that he urged INET to embrace. First, one needs resource sustainability. Second, financial sustainability. And third, social sustainability. We are in anxious times, and while there are great possibilities, the way forward is not exactly clear. In recent months, INET has narrowed and sharpened its focus on things such as the financial system architecture in the context of a system that is unanchored, what economists call radical uncertainty, where the political economy of sound governance, instabilities in credit are a constant challenge that orthodox mechanical theory does not embrace or address. In resource sustainability, one must remember that at the time of Adam Smith, water and air were plentiful and free. As large emerging countries are developing, the extreme taxing of the biosphere, particularly because of energy excesses in the developed countries and the sheer scale of the emerging countries, presents a new challenge that needs to be addressed. We also look very closely at systems of innovation, comparative analysis through time of science, of government, of the role of universities, entrepreneurs, and the capital market. These are the people making the unknown unknowns that create that unanchored, uncertain system. And at times, it's difficult to know if we abuse an unbridled faith in salvation through innovation. But there are also unintended benefits in those unknowns, and to truncate those out of fear is perhaps doing harm, perhaps unintended harm, but harm nonetheless to our society. INET is now embracing a new line of research that I think is perhaps at the cutting edge, the most innovative and most challenging to the profession, where the economics of identity and norms, fallibility, and reflexive dynamics hold the promise of increasing the scope of human agency quite noticeably. Values and preferences are something in economics that have always been frozen, but now norms in reaction to events, traumas, culture, education, what Raymond Williams, the British scholar, calls the long revolution, is an active area of inquiry, and I note the World Development Report of the World Bank this year focused on this theme. There were American Economic Association sessions that include Nobel laureates Joe Stiglitz and George Akerlof, and we have promising research emanating from Dennis Snauer, Tanya Singer, and Antonio Damasio, which I think is how would I say, a light pulling us forward in the fog. Finally is the question of distribution. Sometimes inequality brings forth vitality. Other times, and in its extremes, it brings forth social and economic instability. We look at the causes, the consequences, and the potential remedies. And all of these fields are explored in the context of fallibility and a seamless inseparability between politics and economics. INET focuses also on the methodology of philosophy of science, the teaching of economics, and I want to welcome all the young scholars, the Young Scholars Initiative, the students who are here, and we will have panels in this conference that pertain to the education, the teaching, and what the students want to learn. There will be panels of students and panels of teachers. The theme of this conference on social sustainability is one that is very painful. It's what in the 19th century Britain called the social question. These problems were such that one of my favorite actors historically, who was also a well-known sailor, Sterling Hayden, when he took a leave from his career in film, he sailed his yacht Wanderer to the South Pacific. And in his book describing his voyage, he talked about the most precious thing on board, other than his children, was his library. And he said at the pinnacle of his library was a special section of books that deal with the greatest frontier of all, the relationship between man and man. Marx, Whitman, Thoreau, Henry George, Victor Hugo, Thomas Paine, Jefferson, Lincoln, Emerson, Rousseau, Voltaire, Upton Sinclair, Shaw, Byron, Mark Twain, Franklin Roosevelt, Garrison, Jack London, and of course Shakespeare. This conference here in Paris, in some ways, is a celebration of the weight that has been borne by famous scholars. In particular, Thomas Piketty from Paris has borne a tremendous weight with the work that he's done, the issues he's raised, the controversies that he has inspired. When we talk amongst our board about INET and what is its credo, what is it meant to do? At its core, it is meant to foment critical discourse. And along with other scholars addressing this question, such as Anthony Atkinson, Emmanuel Saez, James Heckman, Joe Stiglitz, Branko Milanovic, we expect to see this vitality, this critical discourse, lead to an awareness and what I believe is a gift to humanity of raising and breeding our capacity for empathy. And it's not just a concern among the lower classes. Many of the most fortunate who I speak with frequently are concerned. The wealthy and powerful often have mastery of the movement of their resources. Corporations and wealthy individuals can evade easily the clutches of a government trying to impose a burden upon them. In this respect, they are very powerful. But at the same time, I know of almost no one who is a corporate leader or a wealthy individual who feels that they have the power to impart an affirmative design to which we could all subscribe that fosters prosperity and social order. The powerful in this era also fear that our world is out of control. One notable example, my former neighbor and hedge fund manager, Paul Tudor Jones, who recently gave a TED Talk on justice, capitalism, and progress, where he said that the ominous trajectory we're on would lead to potentially revolution, higher taxes, or wars, none of which he embraced with enthusiasm. Wen Jiabao, former leader in China, when asked what were people reading, said the most popular book recommended to the elites and devoured by the elites was de Tocqueville's The Ancient Regime and the Revolution. We're in a time since the financial crisis, the environmental crisis, the Occupy movement, inequality, where the legitimacy and coherence of order are something that concern us all. We've had people looking also at the measures of well-being. Joseph Stiglitz, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, and Amartya Sen in this country were inspired by the French government under Sarkozy to explore what it is that really matters. In an early era, Victorian art critic John Ruskin talked about the question of wealth and ilth, and his book, Unto the Last, was considered to be the most profound inspiration of an economic vision according to, by Mahatma Gandhi. Whether it's the pillars of great Indian wisdom or the writings of Joni Mitchell, I remind you she wrote Free Man in Paris, or Buddhist priests in Vietnam or Tibet, or novelists like Melville, Balzac, Tolstoy, Chekhov, and Proust. Or whether it's medical science, where IBM's Watson, the computer diagnostician, who when teamed with a human physician can detect cancer better than either the man or the machine alone. We navigate in our lives most vitally and compassionately through the integration of heart and mind. Marcel Proust once wrote, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." And Antoine Saint-Exupéry, who wrote his famous Little Prince while living in New York, once said, "Only with the heart can one truly see. Everything that matters is invisible to the eyes." I believe that we will strive for illumination in this conference, and we will work to a place where we feel that INET and all of you not only emerge with, but contribute to creating new eyes. Let me now introduce the chairman of the board of INET, Anatole Kaletsky, who is just about to depart. And I want to say personally, in navigating from the startup to the present, you have been a tremendous ally to me. And everything that happens, everything that's going forward, you have a very, very profound imprint. I'll take the bad things. You can have the good things. Anatole.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't know about taking the bad things or the good things. You've certainly taken the time. So I'm going to be very brief because we're already running half an hour late. And I just wanted to say how glad I am, and all of us on the INET board are, that we are able to have a bigger and more dynamic and more successful conference than ever. This is our fifth conference. It's not exactly my fifth conference as chairman, because although I'm the only chairman of the board that INET has had, I wasn't the first chairman of the board, because initially there wasn't a chairman of the board. There wasn't really even a board. It was just a self-organizing evolutionary system. I can take the credit of being present at the creation of INET, when I first talked to George Soros about this shortly after the 2008 crisis, in the winter of 2009. And the point that George and I had in common, our point of agreement, which really led to the launching of INET, was that we could both see that what happened in 2008 wasn't just a crisis in capitalism, it was a crisis of capitalism. It was a crisis of the system, and one from which the system would have to fundamentally evolve. And what we also, I think, both believed was that the structure of the capitalist and free market economy was itself based on, it's really an inversion of the Marxist base superstructure idea. The structure of the real economy was standing on a base of economic ideas, of ideas about the role of the market and of the role of economics as a theory. And those ideas themselves were also part of an ideology. So you had a real economic structure standing on a base of ideas and ideology, And that structure, in turn, supported the ideas and ideology in the nice reflexive process of the kind that George often talks about. So we could see that if this was a crisis of the global capitalist system that had happened in 2008, it was also inevitably going to be a crisis of economic ideas, of economic ideology, and that this was a great opportunity to launch economics in a new direction and really on a new adventure of developing a base for a new kind of economic structure, which is going to evolve, and I think which is evolving over before our eyes, and will continue to evolve over the coming years. Where it will go, I have no idea, but after 5 years of extraordinary exhilaration, but also exhaustion, at trying to keep the pieces of INET together, I feel very privileged and very honored to be able to hand over this task to a man of the eminence of Adair Turner, Lord Adair Turner. And just before I introduce him to you, or bring him in a minute, all I wanted to say at the end is how grateful I am to Rob Johnson, to Jason, our Chief Financial Officer, to Chris, our Chief Operating Officer, to Karen, our Development Officer, and all the rest of the INET staff who have really transformed what, as I said initially, was a sort of evolutionary self-organizing soup of a few people with a few ideas 5 years ago into the organization it is today, an organization which is already changing the way people think about economics, and ultimately, I think, will have at least a role in changing the world. So with that thought, let me now hand over to the man who is going to change the world for us over the next few years as the new chairman of INET from this weekend onwards, Adair Turner. Thank you very much.
Anatole, thank you, and good evening, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here for what I think is the 6th, if I'm right, INET conference, and a huge honor to have been asked to take over as chairman of INET. I have been involved in INET not right from the beginning, as Anatole was with Rob and with George, but pretty soon after. And I think I got involved in INET because I was searching for INET. I was searching for INET partly because of my experience in September 2008. I became chairman of the UK Financial Services Authority on very precisely Saturday, the 20th of September 2008. That was actually 5 days after Lehman's had collapsed and 10 days before the UK authorities had to part-nationalize the UK banking system. I always felt that it was like being appointed captain of the Titanic after you've hit the iceberg, but before we'd actually sunk. But the net result of it was when the immediate problems of the autumn of 2008 were over and we'd at least stabilized the system, I was obviously interested in trying to understand what had really gone wrong. Why had we had this enormous crisis? And what I found, and what many people who had gone through that crisis found, was that most modern macroeconomics wasn't very helpful. As I tried to read ideas that would give me some idea at what had gone on, I found that I was reading people like Hayek and Keynes. I found that I was reading Friedman and Schwartz, Monetary History of the USA. I found that I was reading economic history, but that actually most modern macroeconomics, as it had developed over the previous 30 years, really didn't help us understand what has occurred. Indeed, it was worse than that. It propagated a set of theories in which it was impossible to foresee a crisis coming because the theories proved that no crisis could ever possibly occur. And that is a problem, and that is why I certainly, by 2009, was interested in where were the ideas that were going to take us forward, and therefore fascinated when I first came into contact with George Soros and understood his ideas of reflexivity. And I think George came to see me in London early on in the process, and we talked about what has occurred. And then I became aware that people like Anatole and George and Rob Johnson had got together and believed that we had to launch this exercise, this institution called INET, to really provide new economic thinking. And I was first primarily involved in that at the conference at Cambridge in 2010, where I remember slightly ironically that our first session on new economic thinking was a debate about the relative merits of Keynes and Hayek, who have, of course, been dead for well over half a century. But that simply illustrates that in order to do new economic thinking, we also have to reach back to some of the insights of the past. Over the last 5 years, an enormous amount has been achieved by INET. And Rob has talked about the areas on which we have focused on financial stability, on human capital, on innovation, and on the underlying theories about how economics works when you have radical uncertainty and when the neoclassical propositions about utility maximization are not good representations of the real world. We have done a huge amount of activity in developing ideas, in funding research, some of which has been absolutely cutting edge. We have brought together large groups of people, and this is a group here today, who are energized by the need to develop new economics. We have created all sorts of connections. And as Anatole said, that has relied crucially on the incredibly hard work of Rob as the director of the Institute and all of his key staff. We have achieved a lot, but there is also still a lot to achieve. I think before the crisis, there was a very strong orthodoxy and a confidence that capitalism was bound to deliver favorable results in three respects. First, that it was bound to deliver year after year growth. Secondly, that that growth would reach all parts, that there may be inequalities, but nevertheless everybody would participate in the rising tide which lifted all boats to some degree. And thirdly, a confidence that if you had rising material prosperity, that meant rising human welfare, rising utility. Those three propositions are all challenged. The last 7 years has been an extraordinary setback to the ability of the capitalist system to deliver growth year after year. There are many major economies now where, although we have returned to the level of GDP of 2007, we are not yet back to the level of GDP per capita. And if you actually look at the history of the last 170 years or so in which we can talk about there being a capitalist system, you will not find periods of time that long, 8 years, almost a decade, of no growth in GDP per capita, except in the Great Depression of the 1930s and in the major wars. This is a major setback in the growth machine. It is an even bigger setback in terms of the ability to reach all groups within society. We now have in America the bottom quartile of the population who have essentially achieved no increase in real income for about 30 years, and increasingly over the last 15 years or so, that phenomenon of rising inequality has become more general. And finally, we are less certain these days that even if we do deliver simple material prosperity, that necessarily translates into quality of life, quality of environment, and we are increasingly aware of the dangers that growth can bring with us. So there is much more to do, and as we go forward, INET is going to have to think about how we take the resources that we've got, which have come from our donors and the donors whom we hope to attract in the past. We need to take those resources and focus them to achieve maximum effect. We need to get the balance right between basic fundamental new ideas in economics and the applicability of that to policies which will really change the world. So we undoubtedly have much more to do. But what we will do will undoubtedly also build on what has gone before. So I am pleased to say that this, my new appointment, has not been a coup. It is, as they say in various political environments, a peaceful and orderly transfer of power. And I am very glad to have been involved in this peacefully and transferably orderly of power, though not really power, because I don't think the chairman actually has power. I think there is a degree of herding cats to the extraordinarily energetic system, which is INET as an institution and INET as a wider community. So there will be both change and the need to focus, and also a great deal of continuity. And one of the most important elements of continuity will, of course, be the support of our founder donors and above all of our very first donor, George Soros. And I'd now like to hand over to Rob to say a brief introduction to George this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Adair, and I'm sure you all will join me in feeling the inspiration of the prospect of Adair leading our board in the coming years. He's been a great senior fellow. I'll do a little pitch for his book on endogenous credit and I think debts and devils and things like that that Princeton Press will put out in September. We now turn to our founding sponsor, inspiration, and George Soros. And most of you know my fondness for music, that I would also dig up that the Doors, the rock and roll band leader, Jim Morrison, is buried here in Paris. And he has a famous song. I used to have a sailboat named Shaman. It's called Shaman's Blues. And the first line of the song is, "There'll never be another one like you." Ladies and gentlemen, George Soros.
Well, it gives me really great pleasure and pride to participate in the opening of this conference of INET. As a philanthropist, I think it's probably the most successful enterprise that I have been involved in. I think in a very short period of 5-6 years, the INET has established itself not only in demolishing the monopoly of an economic doctrine that held sway or is still very influential, of course, in the academic circles, but also beginning to contribute to a new opening of opportunities for a better understanding of how the world really works. And I think we started off without a clear strategy, because we've sort of plunged into the radical uncertainty that we were facing, and we were practicing decision-making in that spirit. And I think we have in these let's say 5 years, a little over 5 years, established INET as a real path breaker that is now beginning to bring new insights, producing results that were not possible without demolishing the monopoly that a false doctrine was holding. And now I think we are entering, as an institution, a new phase with Adair Turner as the chairman, in building the institution, narrowing, articulating the strategy that we have evolved in practice. Because we had earlier today a very interesting meeting about bringing humanity into economics, and it turned out we discussed all the issues that INET is already involved in, and the task that is going to face in the future. So it's going to be a new phase, and I hope that it will continue to produce new economic thinking until perhaps at some future date we'll run out of new ideas and become the orthodoxy that will need somebody else to demolish us. So I don't want to take up any more time because I think you have heard a lot of interesting things already, and we are now looking forward to a very interesting debate, which is already something that has evolved in the course of the last few years. Thank you.
When I spoke to you earlier, I spoke about Marcel Proust's suggestion that we look at our situation with new eyes. And the man that I'm about to introduce, Clive Cowdery, I think fits the bill. He's a man with new eyes, fresh eyes and vitality, and is ready to embrace the challenge. And we're very excited he has become part of INET. He's founder of Resolution Insurance, which has consolidated over $200 billion in assets in Britain and the US since 2003. Resolution has devoted, since its formation, over half of its profits and capital gains to a foundation called the Resolution Foundation, which is an independent social and economic research organization, and it's now widely seen as the leading authority in Britain on low earners and policy responses required to lift the living standards. Over its first decades, the Resolution Foundation has successfully created a public and political recognition of what it terms the squeezed middle. With this month's general election in Britain upon us, the candidates appear to all be resonating with responses on ways to address these needs. Resolution, in its first 10 years, has had a tremendous impact. Resolution recently became an INET partner last year, launching the Employment, Equity, and Growth Program at INET at Oxford. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Clive Cowdery.
Good evening. Welcome to this opening session on inequality. INET are right to have chosen this as its very first subject for this year's conference. Inequality has become the economic issue of our age. Not simply because of the social injustices that our current economic model is producing, but because inequality undermines the basic bargain of our post-war economy, that if you work, your living standards will rise and growth will follow. This deal, this basic social contract, has now collapsed. Work does not pay anymore, and productivity does not give you a pay rise. Rises in productivity stop feeding through to wages for the bottom half of workers in America by 1977, in Canada by 1998, in Germany by 2002, and in my country, Britain, the link between productivity and pay had started to erode as early as 2003. This failure of our market economy to generate rising living standards was masked for several decades by apparently strong headline rates of GDP growth. But true growth, broadly based and redistributive, has stopped working now for ordinary people. The collapse of this bargain, work hard and your family's life will improve, poses a threat to the social democratic model that we in Europe have enjoyed since 1945, and that in turn is based on the Enlightenment values that first and most dramatically were developed in this very city over 200 years ago. Paris was the perfect choice by INET to begin our defense of the Enlightenment. It's this threat to the shape of our society, and especially to the ability of working men and women to raise their living standards and those of their children, that created the Resolution Foundation in 2003. I grew up in Britain in the 1960s and 70s as part of what economists in this room would call decile 1. One of 5 children with a single mother who received help from both charities and the welfare state. In fact, by the time I left home in the early 1980s, not a single pound of earned income had come into my household. It's very difficult to describe the mixture of embarrassment and gratitude that causes me even today. During my childhood, the strongest impressions on me came from the working mothers and fathers of the other children at school. In 1970s Britain, it was easy to see that work was a key to happiness and progress. Working men and women had purpose, routine, and most strikingly, they had confidence. However, as I started my working life, things began to change in our country. I saw the hollowing out of British industry begin in the 1980s. This was followed by a financialization of our economy in the 1990s, when asset returns began to be confused with growth and even described, insultingly, as some kind of reward for hard work. This has led to the polarization of our society, falsely divided now between wealth creators and the rest, soon described by media and carpet-bagging opportunistic politicians as the takers. By 2000, I was looking around at a Britain increasingly divided between them and us. That's not my philosophy, those are not my beliefs, and it's not the direction I want my country to go in. Britain's most famous liberal philosopher was John Stuart Mill. In 1865, he said in his most famous book on liberty, "The private landowner, or today's owner of assets, and the welfare recipient are morally equal, for they both derive their living from the sweat of another man's brow." It's this overlooked group today, the workers, that are more essential to our prosperity than entrepreneurs or so-called wealth creators. It's to give a voice to low and middle earners and to grow their share of national income that defines Resolution's purpose. But 10 years into our battle, I have come to a sober conclusion. We have won battles around wages, childcare, and other support mechanisms for working people, but we're losing the war. Small adjustments are not cutting it anymore. The problem is the model itself. Until we have an economic model that replaces the current winner-takes-all, rigged insider economy, no real progress towards equality will be made. And that's why I came here tonight, to issue a call to arms, to ask you, the economics profession, to make this your most urgent priority. Research and lobbying groups like Resolution can only take things so far. We can raise awareness, we can push for policy changes, but it's all just triage until the real remedy, a model for inclusive growth, can be developed and gain wide acceptance. And the credibility that's necessary to influence the central bankers and policymakers of the next decade can only come from you, the economics profession at large, as convened and given voice, direction, and assistance by INET. A model that works for workers will need to address head-on some huge challenges. And as you start your work, we will need to be careful not to just wish these challenges away or hope that the world will somehow become kinder and gentler if left to itself. It will not. We know that's not true. We need answers to 3 obstacles, so big that they're often mentioned with some kind of shrug of inevitability. What can we do in the face of these apparently irresistible global forces? These challenges are, number 1, the impact of globalization and technology and the hollowing out of skilled jobs that follows across Western democracies. 2, the asset economy, with its inbuilt accretion of wealth flowing to the few rather than the many, exactly the form of upward subsidy that John Stuart Mill critiqued. And third, and most importantly, the power imbalance between workers and the owners of capital, which is protected by our political and corporate systems of governance. Share buybacks for shareholders and low pay for everyone else is just one example of this unequal power bargain at work. Now, INET have excelled themselves in convening three of the world's thinkers most involved in this quest for a new and better model to start this debate off tonight. We have Angel Gurria, who as Secretary General of the OECD has increased that organization's focus on inequality. Thomas Piketty, whose work on the upward flow of asset returns has shifted the debate dramatically during the past 2 years. And Professor Joe Stiglitz, who for over a quarter of a century has been patiently explaining to us that the trickle-down model is truly some form of voodoo economics. We will hear from each of them now, and we will then share in a debate, as well as, if time allows, take questions from the room. Sadly, we're going to be unable to keep the Secretary General with us tonight as he has another speaking engagement, but I will coordinate questions between Mr. Piketty and Professor Stiglitz, including, in addition to the discussion on the stage, if you have some careful, succinct questions you'd like me to put to them, please do raise your hand at the appropriate moment. Thank you in advance for your focus on the quest for a new inclusive economic model to guide policymakers in the next decade. Your focus both during this conference, but also in your professional work and the career choices that you take once this conference ends. I'll be back to coordinate questions. I hand you now to the Secretary General.
Thank you, Clive, for your kind introduction. Rob, Anatole and Adair, the recently anointed, and of course, Lord Soros, thank you for your invitation. It's great that we're hosting the INET this year at the OECD. It's a very good privilege. It's a very great pleasure, especially because you chose to call it liberté, égalité et fragilité. Most appropriate. Now, we at the OECD some time ago launched an exercise called NIC, New Approaches to Economic Challenges, precisely to take a hard look, like the INET, to what happened in the crisis, why we didn't see the train coming, you know, it was, or why we didn't do anything about it because it was going choo, 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 you know, just everybody knew it was coming, but somehow we stayed on the rails having a picnic or something. And then it came and just washed us through. And the consequence, we're still living with them. Now, in fact, it was in 2008, we had already been working on inequality. Inequality started before the crisis. The trends were very clear. They were moving very clearly in the wrong direction. But by 2008, we were ready to come out with the first opus, and that we called it Growing Unequal with a question mark. Well, the problem is we very soon removed the question mark. The brutality of the numbers was very obvious, and you know, nothing like a good crisis to exacerbate inequality. And we had as good as they come, huh? So we have seen the numbers get worse. Well, 3 years later, we removed the question mark, and we called it Divided We Stand. The subtitle was Why Inequality Keeps Rising. The study showed how megatrends such as technological change, which Clive alluded to, were combining with policies that ignored the distributional effects to create a sort of permanent, perfect storm of rising inequalities. Advances in technology have been a key driver of growth, but those with low skills have been clearly left behind. Now, later this year, we'll release our next major review about the inequality. Mostly, it will be focused on the labor market and how the labor market is a very clear source of these inequalities. And I'd love to tell you that this time the message is more positive, that countries managed to get their social and economic goals aligned, that inequality is finally starting to fall. Alas, this is not the case. Not the case. The gap between the rich and the poor widened in many countries throughout the crisis, has continued to grow in what after the crisis, we're still in the crisis in many places, but I'd say in this period where we seem to be getting out of it. Today in the OECD area, the average income of the richest 10% of the population is 10 times that of the poorest. These are averages, of course. And, so what? Well, the problem is in the 80s, it was 7 times. And in the 90s, it was 8 times. So it has grown by 40% or by 30% in the last 20 years, 25 years. One generation, it grew by about 30%. That's without the crisis. Now, it exacerbated during the crisis. In the crisis years, in the first 3 years, it actually grew more than in the 12 years before. So, it just to put in context, the crisis, of course, did accelerate these trends. And it's taking place even in traditionally very egalitarian societies, the Nordic countries, Germany, etc. And they can be measured in many ways, not just in terms of the revenue. For example, people with high socioeconomic levels can expect to live as much as 10 years longer than people with low socioeconomic backgrounds. 10 years longer. Is it normal that we have so little social mobility in some countries? That studying and working hard seem to influence little on your income? And that, probably this was the case 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Problem is, it continues to be the case. Is it normal that top 1% of the population, this has become almost a cliche, gets a fifth or a third or nearly a half in some countries like the US of all the observed income growth? And of course, the answer is no. It can't be the case. It can't be the normal. But the problem is, as Clive has said, that it needs really a call to arms in order to change the trend. Reducing inequalities is a moral issue, it's a social issue, it's a political imperative. But we know now that it is also economically smart. Our latest analysis shows that growth, which is so unequally distributed, is not sustainable, because high levels of inequality also harm long-term economic growth. Actually, it's a relationship between the level of increase of the Gini and the impact on growth over the medium and long term. Income disparities, in particular at the bottom 40% of the income ladder, can hold back economic growth because they limit the ability of young people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds to invest in their human capital and in their skills. It affects their capacity to find productive and rewarding jobs and fully engage with society. Inequality has thus become a drag on economic growth. And if it continues to increase at the rate at which we have seen it grow, in another generation, maybe GDP will be close to 10% lower than it would have in the absence of such inequality. So clearly, conventional economic thinking is not going to address this. The numbers have gotten bleaker, bigger, faster, and are having a much greater impact than we thought. For some time, we thought inequality was not only natural, but always desirable. The only problem is it just got out of hand, too big, and we did not have the brakes, we did not have the mechanisms in order to be able to moderate it. So we must break the policy mold, develop new models of inclusive growth. And then here, this is capital letters. Inclusive growth is, of course, the answer to inequalities. It's about policies with inclusive growth. We need a new policy mix to boost the participation of women, of migrants, of people with disabilities in economic activity, to guarantee access to quality education, regardless of economic background, and to ensure the rich pay their fair share of taxes, and that fiscal policy functions as an effective social equalizer. That is another drama. We used to say, well, all you got to do is throw some taxes at it, and we'll fix it. And it used to be that, at least in the United States and Europe, you start with the same level of inequality as, say, Latin America, after the taxes, after Social Security contributions, and you got the benefits, you eliminated up to half of that inequality. No longer. The tax changes seem to be less and less effective here, and unfortunately, they continue to be as ineffective in developing countries, in particular in the most unequal region of the world, which is Latin America. Not the poorest, but the most unequal. Haven't been able to address it. Our countries must commit to policies that combine strong economic growth and improvements in opportunities for all. We at the OECD are working with governments to advance this policy agenda through these new approaches to economic challenges initiative and the inclusive growth initiative. We're trying to design a new framework for governance to assess how policies impact different social groups, different ways, level the playing field, and create better opportunities for the bottom 70, 80, or 90% of our societies, because in some cases, the polarization has been such that it's capturing such large segments of the population. So, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, inequalities are undermining our societies. They're damaging our economies. And they're also playing a very important part in the erosion of trust that we have seen. In the erosion of trust on what? Well, of everything we built in 100 years, and presidents, prime ministers, ministers, political parties, banks, multinationals, even international organizations, except the OECD, of course. No. But let me say that this corrosion is happening at an extremely rapid pace. And this corrosion is not just in the level of income, but it is also corroding the social pact, the understandings that governments have with societies that are explicit and implicit. It's weakening the foundations of democracy, in a word. There's now a significant, compelling body of evidence that this is the case. Now it's time to turn this evidence into new policies. Time to turn economics into an effective tool for inclusion. Time to redesign the rules of the game, to redistribute opportunities and broadly share the benefits of a more resilient, more inclusive, more sustainable growth. The OECD stands ready to keep working hard, to keep confronting conventional thinking, searching for new paths, identifying best practices in partnership with exemplary institutions like INET to promote better policies for better lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General, and thank you for opening tonight's session as well as being able to host the sessions that the next 2 days have as well. Thomas Piketty.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So first let me apologize that my English sounds a lot like French, but at least this will remind you that you are in Paris, in case you have forgotten. So I'm very glad to be here tonight to talk to you about inequality. So I will present a number of findings from my research and some of the debates that have been going on in the past year. So most of what I'm going to present today, I'm going to present a number of results that are based on my book, Capital in the 21st Century. I should say right away that in this research, what I have tried to do is I try to contribute to put the study of inequality and the study of the distribution back at the center of economics. But the way I have been doing that and the way we have been doing that is through a very collective process of data collection and historical data collection on income and wealth. So the study of inequality was, in a way, at the center of economics in the 19th century or in different time period in the past. Now, what's new in what we have been doing is that we have been able to collect historical data at a much larger scale than what was done before. And this was done, I started working on the history of income and wealth inequality in France about 15 years ago, but I could never have extended this project to so many countries without Tony Atkinson, who played a very central role to collect data for Britain and many other countries, without Emmanuel Saez, with whom I have been working in the US, and Emmanuel has also worked on Japan and Canada, without Facundo Alvaredo, who has worked on Argentina and Spain. I cannot refer to everybody, but this really comes from a very collective research program. And so in this presentation, I will present a couple of results, but if you want to have a better sense of the entire set of findings, please have a look at this website where you will have, I'm sorry that I cannot put the book online yet, but you probably can find it somewhere. But at least you can find all the statistical series and data online. So today in this presentation, I'm going to try to present very quickly 3 points. One about the long-run evolution of income inequality and about the end of the Kuznets curve, the end in sort of universal laws and beliefs in deterministic laws about the evolution of income inequality. The second point will be more about wealth, and in particular the evolution of the total wealth-income ratio, which seems to be returning to very high levels. And the third point will be about the future of wealth inequality. So, of course, all these issues are related because higher inequality of income tends to contribute to higher inequality of wealth and assets and property in the longer run. And I think in the very long run, inequality in asset and property is probably even more important than inequality of income, but the two are very much related. So let me start with the long-run evolution of income inequality. So most of the data that we have collected on income inequality comes from this database, the World Top Income Database. So all the countries in red are already in the database. The countries in blue are joining the database. So this work would not have been possible without over 20 researchers and without a number of funders, including INET, which has been contributed to the financing of this work over the past, 5 or 6 years. We have other funders. We always need more money because this is costly to extend the data collection process to more countries. In particular, one good impact of the publication of the book is that we now have access to more data, and in particular more fiscal data in a number of emerging countries, including Brazil and also Mexico and Chile and Korea and Taiwan, where we could not access the fiscal data before that. So that's good news. And so this is, the database is extending. So let me show you one example of what we find. So I will present a number of facts about inequality in the long run. You can have, I will present 3 facts, one about income inequality, one about wealth inequality, one about wealth-income ratio. These 3 facts are presented in this paper that was published in Science with Emmanuel Saez in 2014. So this is a 5-page long paper. So if you don't want to read my book, you know that this is a good thing with real science is that they want you to be short. And so in science, they wanted a 5-page paper. So this is a 5-page paper. And I will show you 3 facts from this, coming from this 5-page paper. So fact number 1. In 1900, 1910, income inequality was much higher in Europe than in the US. In 2000, 2010, it is a lot higher in the US. So this is what you get if you take averages. So here I am showing you decennial averages so that we can focus on very long-run evolution. And so you can see that the top 10% income share in the US has increased a lot starting around 1970, 1980. And it used to be, in the post-war period, fairly close to the European average. So what Europe means on this graph is the GDP-weighted average of Germany, France, Britain, Italy, and Sweden. So it's not quite Europe, but it's a very big part of Western Europe, at least. And you have similar evolution in most continental European countries, at least. So let's call it Europe for simplicity. And so you can see that you have this very different evolution in Europe and the US. You have a rising inequality in Europe as well, but it is much less strong than in the US. Now, if you look at the annual evolution for the US, so this is the same graph as before, except that now I'm showing you the annual series instead of the decennial averages. So both are useful. You know, with the decennial averages, you focus on the very long-run trend. Now, if you look at the annual series, the history of inequality is much more chaotic at the annual level, in particular because of capital gains and the stock market. So you can see, you know, in 2001 and 2, or 2008 and 9, this is not a good time to make capital gains. So this is not a good time to sell your equity, make capital gains. It's not a good time for very large bonuses also. But then after the crisis, you can see that the long-run trend seems to continue. Okay, so even if you take away the capital gains entirely, you still have, a very strong trend. And when you put the capital gain, so you can see 2012, which is the latest point on this graph, is a little bit above 2007, which was on the eve of the crisis, and which was itself a little bit above 1928, which was the previous highest point in the century. So of course, when you see this graph, you see that the long-run evolution of inequality, involves very different movements. So the big decline in inequality in the first half of the century was what Kuznets found in the 1950s. So Kuznets was the first economist to compute GDP series for the US, and he was also the first economist to compute income inequality series by using the same income tax data that we did. So we confirmed the Kuznets findings. He didn't have Excel, but he did the computation right. The only difference is that we have many more years of data. So Kuznets was writing in the 50s, so he had a very optimistic view of the world, the idea of a Kuznets curve, a natural decline in inequality in advanced stages of development, and then a stabilization, which is indeed what we had in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So when you have a stabilization of the share of total income going here to the top 10%, it means that everybody benefits from growth in the same proportion. If you have 2% or 3% growth rate in 1960 or 1970, a stable top 10% share means that you take the average income of the top 10% or the average income of the bottom 90, they all grow at 2 or 3%. So, you have rich people, poor people, but everybody is going up at the same speed. So in a way, all what you care about is to have more growth. This stabilization is the sort of post-war ideal of balanced growth. And this was right at the time, except that, starting in the 1980, you have a very different evolution. So when you go from 1/3 of total income to the top 10 to over 1/2 of total income to the top 10, these are serious numbers. It's no more than just a few individuals who are getting very rich, which, after all, if it's just a few football players, nobody cares. But if it's a significant share from a macroeconomic viewpoint of national income, then it's a different story, because it means that a huge part of the growth over this period was in effect absorbed by the top 10%. And with, many people now, I think, agree that this contributed not only to the stagnation of median household income, but also to the rise of household debt and to the fragilization of the financial system itself. So how do you explain such an evolution? So what's interesting, so let's return to the Europe-US comparison, is that you have different evolution in different countries. So this is Europe-US. This is Japan. So you see Japan is in between Europe and the US. So that's interesting because these are the three parts of the developed world. And you can see that you have fairly different evolution. Well, you have rising inequality everywhere, that's true, but with very different proportions. So how do you explain this? Well, you cannot just blame globalization, because globalization happened not only in the US, but also in Japan, also in Europe. So, the idea that this is all due to globalization and, China enters the world labor market, this is putting pressure on the low-skill labor force in developed countries. I'm not saying that's not part of the story, but this cannot be the entire story, otherwise you would have the same evolution everywhere. So you need country-specific explanation, country-specific institutions and policies that play the role. And by and large, clearly the labor market institutions, the educational institutions, the social systems, the fiscal system in the US has contributed to rising inequality much more than in Europe and in Japan. So let me take a couple of examples, but generally speaking, the rise in US inequality in recent decades is mostly due to rising inequality of labor income, although rising inequality of wealth is becoming a bigger and bigger issue now. This is due to a mixture of reasons: changing supply and demand of skill, race between education and technology, globalization, more unequal access to skill in the US, rising tuition, insufficient public investment in the education system. Also, unprecedented rise of top managerial compensation in the US, which is very difficult to explain just on the basis of performance or productivity, and certainly changing incentives, changing corporate government system, a very large cut in top income tax rate in the US contributed to a huge unprecedented rise in top managerial compensation. Falling minimum wage in the US and more generally a declining role of unions played a big role, and in some countries the minimum wage sort of compensated partly the decline of union. In countries like the US, certainly it exacerbated the evolution. So the general conclusion is that there's a whole set of institutions and policy which matter and which allow broader groups in society to benefit from globalization or to lose from globalization. So just to give one graph, which is taken from my book, which I find quite striking, which is the evolution of the minimum wage in France and the US. So this is the real value of the minimum wage expressed in dollars or euros of 2013. And so the scale for France is on the left-hand side in euros. The scale for the US is on the right-hand side, but 1 euro is $1.2, so it's roughly the same purchasing power for both scales. Okay? So you can compare the purchasing power. Now you can see that minimum wage has increased a lot in France. Some people will say that it is too high today because of the very high payroll tax. It's another issue, but I think certainly it is too low in the US. It's quite striking to see that the purchasing power of the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage in the US today is $7.2 per hour. This is less than the $10 per hour that you had in the late 1960s. And this is quite unusual for a country to have a decline in the absolute value of the minimum wage over half a century. Okay? And at that time, in the 60s, the unemployment rate was not higher than what it is today. So, the people were employed, but with higher wages, everybody was than today. So this is quite unusual, and this kind of change in policy matters. I want to show you this graph about unequal access to higher education in the US, which I find quite striking. This comes from research by Emmanuel Saez and Raj Shetty. You have the parental income rank on the horizontal axis, and you have the proportion of children attending college. So this is for today. This was observed around 2010. So now you almost have the 45-degree line. So you go almost from 0 to 100%. Well, not quite. If your parents are very poor, you still have a 20% chance to go to college. And if your parents are very rich, you have a 90% chance. So it doesn't quite go from 0 to 100, but still, it's quite striking. And there is a lot of evidence that it's a bit less extreme in Europe and to some extent in Japan. So probably the very high tuition fees and very unequal funding of the US higher education system is partly the explanation for this. I think this is an example where the gap between the official meritocratic discourse and the reality is particularly strong. You have the official discourse of a very mobile society and people access, and then you have this, and well, that's a problem, and that's probably contributing, the fact that the bottom half of the US population, or bottom 70% of the population, not only doesn't go to Harvard, but goes to high school and community college that are much less well-funded than the upper groups in society, has contributed certainly to rising inequality. So, there's another statistic that I give in the book, which is that the average income of the parents of Harvard undergrad right now corresponds to the average income of the top 2% of the US distribution of family income, which doesn't mean that nobody comes from the lower groups, but this means that the people who come from below the top 2 are sufficiently few, and the people who come from the top 2 are sufficiently high within the top 2, that the overall average is as if the students had all been picked at random within the top 2. Which again, creates a feeling that, yes, sometimes you have a big gap between the official discourse and the reality. So I think it's, in every country, not only in the US, but also in France, you have very strong claims about the equal opportunity and the fact that we have a very, very meritocratic system. And then you have the reality, which huge gap between what we claim and the reality. So I think it's important to put this kind of claims under public scrutiny, to collect data and to, put this on the bright light, and then we can have a more informed democratic discussion about this. So let me accelerate a little bit because I've spent a lot of time on this first point. Let me summarize quickly the other 2 points I would like to make, which are more about the long-run evolution of wealth than about the long-run evolution of labor income. My second point is about what I call in the book the return of a patrimonial or wealth-based society. That's particularly strong in Europe and Japan, and where wealth to income ratios seem to be returning to very high levels. That's particularly true in Europe and Japan, partly because these are regions with very low population growth. And the intuition is that when you have a slow growth society, wealth accumulated in the past can naturally become very important. In the very long run, this can be relevant for the entire world. Now, this is not bad in itself, having a very high wealth-to-income ratio, if this is just due to aging and people accumulate more pension funds and more real estate wealth for their old age, if you have a large middle-class share in total wealth, there's nothing bad in itself. Now, the problem is that in practice, it comes with very high inequality of wealth. This also comes with sometimes with big bubbles and particular asset prices. In particular, real estate is playing a very big role in this evolution. And this, what I call the metamorphosis of capital, the fact that you have different type of asset with huge changes in relative prices, call for new regulations of property relations. So let me show you, let me jump to a couple of graphs here. So this is the evolution. So this is the ratio of private household wealth to national income in the top 8 developed economies in the world. So according to some economic textbook, the ratio of wealth to income is supposed to be a constant. Now, as you can see, it doesn't look too much like a constant, so, we should be careful with economic textbook. Sometimes in textbook, when we don't know much about something, we just assume it's a constant, which, of course, if you have only one data point, everything is a constant. But in fact, there's really no reason why it should be a constant. Even in the most conventional economic model of capital accumulation, any ratio of capital to output or wealth to income can be an equilibrium. It all depends on how much you save and invest as compared to how fast you grow in terms of population and underlying productivity growth. Now, in a more complicated model where you have bargaining power over the return to assets, where you have big speculation over some relative price, big movement in, for instance, the relative price of real estate, or other assets, then there's even less reason that it should be a constant. This brings even additional reason for variation, and you can see the Japanese real estate bubble in 1985 to 1990, where you have this huge increase in the value of wealth to income. Well, now let me show you the Spanish bubble as compared to the Japanese bubble, and you can see that it was even bigger. And so, you know, when you make a mistake, it's always difficult to put a price on capital. You know, some people do this for a business, as you know, and that's difficult, you know, whether you put price on real estate or put a price on the stock market. My point is that making a 10% mistake on the price of asset is a lot more dangerous for the real economy when you have a ratio of wealth to income that's 7 or 8 years of GDP, like in Spain in 2007, than when you have a ratio of 2 or 3 years back in 1970. So having a high wealth to income ratio is not bad in itself. You know, it could come with aging, with if you have a big middle class share in total wealth, it's not a problem, except that it calls for new regulation, and in particular, prudential regulation of bubbles. You know, probably the European Central Bank should have calmed down the process in Spain much before, and so this kind of data maybe can help. Also, this has consequences not only for prudential regulation, but also for the access to property. When you have this very high value of wealth to income, and in particular real estate price to income, it means that it's very difficult for the new generation, for the young, to access property if you don't have family wealth. Okay, so in Spain or Italy or France or most European countries, also in Japan, you know, if you don't have family wealth, accessing property just with your labor income is much more difficult at the end of the period, at the beginning of the period. So this has very strong consequences for mobility of wealth. And, you know, it will make sense when you have such a high ratio of wealth to income, probably to tax income and wages a bit less, and to tax property and wealth a bit more. Now, the problem is that because of tax competition, we tend to do the opposite, so we tend to exacerbate this evolution rather than to counteract them. Another graph that I want to show you is that the fact that part of the rise in private capital comes from the decline in public capital. So what's public capital? Well, this is defined the same way as private wealth. This is the difference between government assets and government debt. So you can see Italy at the end of the period that has negative public capital, which means that they have more public debt than public assets. Okay, so this means that even if the Italian government at the end of the period, even if they were selling all the public assets, all the schools, all the hospitals, all the public assets they have to sell, that will not be enough to repay their public debt. They will still have minus 60, 70%. Now, Italy is interesting because it is also, you know, they are at the bottom of the class for public capital, but they are at the top of the class for private capital. And of course, this is very much consistent because it is the Italian households that have bought the public debt and the privatized public assets that have been sold by the Italian government over the years. So you have more private capital just because the public capital is lower. Now, that's only part of the increase in private capital. You can see in the case of Italy, I don't know if you can read this, but the increase in private capital has been of over 4 years of national income, whereas the decline in public capital has been only 1 year. So if you want, this transfer from public to private wealth explains only 1/4 of the increase in private wealth, which is a lot, but still it's only 1/4. Now, you know, when I say, and I'm not saying that the Italian government should sell the public schools and public hospitals to repay the debt. You know, many people will be shocked if we had to pay rent to the owners of the public schools to which we send our children. But what I want to stress is that in a way, this is already what we are doing. Because when you have a public debt that's bigger than the value of your public assets, in effect, you can end up paying in interest payment more than what you would pay in rent to the owners of the public assets. So this is this is a bit more abstract operation because this goes through the financial intermediation system. But in the end, if you take a country like Italy right now, they are repaying between 5 and 6% of GDP in interest payment each year, and the total budget going to their entire university system is about 1% of GDP. So is this the right way to prepare the future and to invest in the young generation? You know, I'm not so sure. And if you look at the history of public debt, France and Germany, they had 200% of GDP in public debt in 1945, so much more than Italy today and even more than Greece today. And of course, they never repaid it. You know, in 1955, they were down to 20% of GDP in public debt. And it's not because they had huge budget surplus between 1945 and 1955. It's because they had a lot of inflation, they had debt restructuring, you had the post-war debt agreement. And this is what allowed the French and German government to invest in growth in the 50s, 60s, 70s, to invest in public infrastructure, invest in education, health. And it's a bit ironical, or it's at least a clear example of historical amnesia, that these same countries are now asking Italy and Southern Europe, and are asking themselves, because they are mistreating Southern Europe, but they are also mistreating themselves, to repay this just by accumulating budget surplus years after years, which, as we know, will take forever. So I guess, I have already used most of my time, so, I'm not going to present all of this. The future of wealth inequality, let me just conclude by saying that, the gap between the average rate of return to capital and the growth rate might not be huge, but not everybody gets the same rate of return. And probably financial deregulation has contributed to increased also inequality in access to different financial rate of return. Just to give you an example, the data we have on wealth suggests that top wealth groups are growing much faster than average wealth. So this comes from the Forbes rankings, which is not, I should say right away, it's not particularly reliable data, and it's a way, it's sad that we live at a time where we have to read magazines to learn about wealth. I would prefer to read OECD publication, or I should not say that because Secretary General is away. But I know the OECD is trying, and the IMF is trying, and Eurostat is trying. But in the end, with the household surveys that they are organizing to measure inequality and distribution, they are not really able to come with good measures, in particular for wealth distribution. And part of the reason is because we don't have the administrative data, the tax system, the automatic transmission on cross-border financial assets, which for many years were opposed by developed countries' government, and also by a number of international organizations, including the IMF and the OECD. So now everybody says to be in favor of transparency and automatic transmission of bank information, but the truth is that we've not seen it yet. And so we have to do with what we have, and this kind of Forbes data suggests that the top wealth are rising much, much faster than average wage, which of course cannot continue forever. Otherwise, the share of world wealth going to very top groups will go to 100%, which I think everybody would agree is too much. And so I'm not saying this will go to 100%. This will certainly stop much before that. Where will it stop exactly? Nobody knows. And that's, I think, a problem in itself. Part of the reason is that you have very different rate of return. Here, this is an example using university endowments in the US, where at least these people publish data, so I can actually compare, what they do with their endowment and how they get their return. As you can see, they've been doing very well. These are rate of return after deduction of inflation, after deduction of all administrative costs. And the bigger they are, the better they do. Now, if this applies only to university, maybe this is okay because universities are doing useful things with the money. Although this contributes to very high inequality between community college and top universities. But if this is happening for the entire distribution of wealth, you can see that this creates a powerful unequalizing force. And I think that's partly what's happening together with privatization of wealth in some cases. Let me conclude by saying that the history of taxation is complicated, as you can see. Or, I don't know if it's unpredictable, but I think these things can change more quickly than what we sometimes imagine. A century ago, there was no income tax, and many people, including in the US, were saying that the income tax would never happen. And indeed, the Constitution in the US made it impossible to happen until 1913. And then suddenly it happened. And, top tax rate went to very high level, in particular in the US, in the UK. This is true for the income tax. This is also true for the top tax rate on inheritance, where you can see that, very high tax progressivity has been an invention of the US and the UK historically, not France or Germany. You know, the only time where you have very high tax rate in Germany in between 1946 and 1948, and you can see also on the previous graph for income, you see 1946 to 1948 in Germany, you have 90%. This is because the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans, because this is the Allied Control Council. This is the time where when Germany gets its sovereignty back in 1949, they reduce immediately the top tax rate to like 50% very quickly, and they want to go away from these crazy American levels of 90%. Now, what's interesting is that you have the same in Japan, and the Americans were not doing this to punish the Germans or the Japanese, because they were doing the same at home at the same time. So this was not viewed as a punishment. At that time, this was viewed as part of the civilization package somehow. You know, you bring democratic institution, and together with this, you bring the fiscal institution that can prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy with excessive concentration of income and wealth at the top. So I know this can sound like ancient history to us, but in fact, it's not so old. And I think, you know, we have all to learn by trying to look quietly at this history of taxation and inequality. Productivity growth rate in the US were higher in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when you had these very high top tax rates that they have been since the Reagan years. So, you know, it's difficult to have a quiet discussion about this and a quiet discussion about taxation in general, because people get excited very fast. But, you know, maybe looking at historical evidence can help to have a more informed conversation, and that's what I'm trying to contribute.
We have one more speaker tonight, Professor Joe Stiglitz. During the 10 minutes that Joe's just going to give us an overview of the key themes, if you do have any questions you'd like to address to either Thomas or Joe, please think about that question. Please strip it down to its core, basic, essential elements. Please remove from it any statements you'd like to make. You've got lots of time to interact with people during the next couple of days, and then we'll make certain that you are able to attract the attention of somebody with a microphone. Joe.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. And my remarks will really complement much of what Thomas has said. I'm going to take a little bit American-centric focus, partly because America has always led the way, and we are now leading the way in inequality. And those countries that have imitated American institutions, legal frameworks, are having the same kind of rise in inequality. And that itself says something that Thomas emphasized, that inequality is as much a result of our institutions, our policies, than of underlying economic forces. There are huge disparities and inequalities around the world. The underlying economic forces are largely global, and that includes globalization and technology. But the way they play out varies very greatly across countries. And this, of course, was one of the major themes in my book, The Price of Inequality. So what I want to do is very, very quickly, because the landscape has already been well described, just review, highlight a couple of points about what's been happening, and then spend most of my time talking about the causes and some of the policies. Most of this is based on theoretical work, but including a paper of mine that will be coming out either early next week. The first important thing I want to emphasize is that the change in inequality has barely been cataclysmic. We used to say that watching inequality grow was like watching the grass grow. It happened, but it happened very slowly. But what's been happening since 1980 has been happening very rapidly, as Thomas's graph made so clear. The second thing I want to just reiterate was that it's changed our view about the inevitable trends. When I was, the view that of Kuznick's law, that it was inevitable that as an economy developed, that inequality would eventually grow. There was an underlying rationale for Kuznets. It was not only an empirical finding. There was a theoretical rationale for why, in the initial stages of development, inequality would grow, as it's been growing in China. But there was a rationale for why eventually it would decline. I grew up in the what I discovered, especially after reading Thomas's book. I grew up in what was called what was the golden age of capitalism. I didn't realize it was a golden age because I thought it was actually pretty terrible. And now to be told that's the best that capitalism gets is extraordinarily disturbing. And I'm going to end with a little bit. I come from Indiana. We are very optimistic. And I'm going to say why I think it's not a question of capitalism. It's really a question of politics and how we shape our institutions. It's also been emphasized that there are many dimensions to inequality. Income just is only one. It captures part. Inequalities of health are even probably greater, wealth. But one I want to highlight, it's been mentioned a couple of times, but I do want to highlight it because is inequality of opportunity. Particularly in America, the debate, a lot of people on the conservative side said, we don't care about what the inequality of outcomes are. What we really care about, the American dream, is about equality of opportunity. The unfortunate thing was that we weren't doing very well on that either. And that, in fact, in the United States today, the inequality of opportunity is probably is among the worst in the advanced countries, which is another way of saying it is the life prospects of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in almost any of the other advanced countries. And that really is undermining a basic part of our own identity, which is the American dream. To academics, of course, this was not a surprise because we've understood that there's a high correlation between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunity. There are many reasons for that, and this is a really important research topic. The graph that was shown relating the education, college education with the parents' income is one of the major reasons for this, but there are a number of others. And this trying to understand more deeply this link between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunity is, I think, a very important research topic. As is a more general theoretical one of how do we conceive of, how do we assess when does one society have more equality of opportunity than others? A lot of research that I did and Tony Atkinson and other people did about how do we say one society has more equality of outcome than another. And we develop notions about one Lorentz curve being located outside of another as an example. Ranking societies by opportunity is even more difficult because that is a ranking not only a probability, not just a probability distribution, but it's a ranking of matrices, and the analytic difficulties there are more challenging. The other idea that's been emphasized, but I want to again highlight, is that the notion that trickle-down economics, an idea that never really had a theoretical or empirical basis, has really not been evidenced. It's really not been working. You know, in the 1960s, again with President Kennedy, there was a moment of hope where it was said that a rising tide lifts all boats. But the yachts have been doing very, very well, as Thomas's graph showed you. Those at the top 1%, 0.1% have been doing very well. But when we look at median income in the United States, median income is lower than it was a quarter century ago. Median income of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. When a society, when an economy fails to deliver, fails to bring income growth to a majority of its citizens, then you have to say that economic system is not working. And that is really what this conference, in some sense, is about. It's not just about inequality. It's about something has happened to our economic system. That yes, GDP may be going up, but a majority of our citizens are not seeing increases in their income. And if that's true, it really says something profound about the way our economy works. One more observation that Secretary General OECD emphasized, which is that the view that was held, again, 40, 50 years ago, that there was a major trade-off between growth and inequality. Our view on this has changed. Arthur Okun, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson, wrote a famous book called The Big Trade-Off. And he said, yes, you can be concerned about inequality, but the only way to do if we were to do anything about reducing inequality, it would necessitate lower economic growth, poor economic performance. And the view that the Secretary General, the IMF, and my own book, The Price of Inequality, the reason I chose the name The Price of Inequality was to emphasize that we actually pay a high price for this inequality, not only in terms of our society, not only in terms of our democracy, but even more narrowly in terms of our economy, that it leads to poor economic performance, that it leads to more economic instability. The reasons for this, the channels through which this happens, is again a very important research topic, and important work is going on in a number of places about trying to parse out the various reasons for which this is true. What I want to spend, the bulk of my time is a brief discussion of some of the understanding some of the causes. And to do that, I want to frame what's been happening to our economy, to the distribution of income, in contrast to some ideas that were the center of research 60 years ago. Clive Cowdery, a very distinguished economist at Cambridge University, formulated a set of what was called stylized facts, descriptions of what had been happening over the preceding half century. And he posed a number of challenges to the economics profession to try to explain, to try to develop models that could explain those stylized facts. The sad thing was as soon as they explained these stylized facts, developed actually quite interesting models, the facts were no longer true. So all the models that were developed in that era to explain those stylized facts, by definition, can't explain the new stylized facts that are markedly different. So the old stylized facts says the share of capital and labor were constant. As you saw, the share of capital and labor are not constant. The old stylized fact, which was based on a long body of data, was that the capital output ratio was relatively constant, and now we've seen data that the wealth income ratio has increased very markedly. Well, the new stylized facts, if one doesn't interpret them very carefully, really pose a challenge not only to the old stylized facts, but to some basic long-held beliefs in economics. In particular, what I want to say is if one thinks of wealth as measured in the kind of data that was described here as capital, one is left with a very serious quandary. Because one of the most deeply seated ideas in economics is the law of diminishing returns. If the economy is engaged in capital deepening, the increase in the capital output ratio would be normally associated with an increase in the capital effective labor ratio. And that one of the deepest seated beliefs is the law of diminishing returns. And if that's the case, then the return to capital ought to be coming down. And the standard models that are so beloved by so many of the students here, where they use Cobb-Douglas production functions, average and marginal productivities would be going down in tandem, and the returns would have actually fallen quite significantly. But there's another equally disturbing puzzle that was highlighted in Clive's remarks earlier, and that is that capital deepening, having more capital per worker, should mean that wages should be rising. Now, what is interesting is, as it's pointed out in the United States, average productivity has gone up. And particularly, and average productivity has gone up. Depends on what grouping you have, but a broad definition, since the late 70s by about a factor of 2. So there's significant increases in average productivity. But wages have stagnated, and particularly if you exclude the wages of the top 1%. And that top 1%, some of us not sure whether those people are really working, let alone being called laborers. That is to say, those are the bank executives, the people who engage in variety kinds of active activities, but they're certainly not your image of somebody who's slaving in the coal mine. So if you exclude that, the share of labor has really come down dramatically. It's gone down about 25%. That's a dramatic change in a relatively short period of time. So what that means is, another way of saying this is that while average productivity has gone up, wages for a large body of people, average wages, median wages, have stagnated or even gone down. Now again, the standard models say that roughly average and marginal productivities ought to be moving roughly together, certainly not move in this very disparate way. And if we had a competitive model, then wages ought to be going up in tandem with the productivities. That hasn't been happening. That is the dramatic fact that I think that one needs to come to terms with. Now, there are there's a key observation and interpretation of that observation that I think explains these puzzles, these quandaries. There's one more observation I want to make, which is, if you look at the United States, as I say, I've looked at the data in the United States more closely, you look at the savings rate in the United States, and you look, if you interpreted the wealth income ratio as a capital income ratio, you can't explain what's happened to the capital output ratio. In fact, given the low savings rate in the United States, the capital output ratio ought to be falling, not rising. So what is going on? Well, the answer entails understanding one important thing that has gotten a lot of attention, and Thomas has noted it, but I'm not sure it's given the right sufficient importance, which capital and wealth are very different ideas. Capital, although they're often used in a synonymous way, economists, when we used our old production function, output is a function of capital and labor, had in mind physical capital, machines, things that would increase the productivity of labor. But when we talk about wealth, we include not only those machines, but we also include land. But we also include the capitalized value of other sources of rents. What are some of those other sources of rents? There can be monopoly rents. There can be exploitation rents. There can be intellectual property rents. There can be all kinds of rents in our society. The financial sector, for instance, the banks, if they succeed in getting a law passed that says that the government will bail them out if there's a problem, that's a transfer of large amounts of money from the government to the banks. And the expected value of that option value gets capitalized, and that leads to an increase in value of the banking sector. Now, there's a corresponding loss. The wealth of taxpayers has gone down because we've just given a big gift to the banks. But we don't record in our balance sheet the loss to the taxpayers. Just give you one example of how big a little thing can be in terms of our wealth. We give, say, $15 billion a year, not a lot of money, it's just 1/10 of 1% of GDP. We give $15 billion a year to rich farmers. The evidence is that much of that gets capitalized in agricultural land values. Well, you capitalize it at a rate of 1 or 2%, a discount rate, that gets multiplied into $1 trillion. So the point I want to make is when we're talking about wealth, it includes not only the productive capital of our economy, but also the capitalized value of all these rents. And if the structure of our economy is changing in ways that give more prominence to rents, then wealth will be going up, but the productivity of our economy may not change at all. It may be that people are willing to pay more for land in the Riviera. So the wealth holdings of the people who own that land in the Riviera have gone up. But that doesn't mean France is any wealthier because the value of the land has gone up. These numbers are very large and account, I think, for much of the quandaries that we've seen. In fact, when I look back at my own work that I did in my own thesis a number of years ago, and in the major mistake, I was trying to get an equilibrium theory of wealth and income distribution, where I was using a neoclassical model where I had capital and labor, and we didn't have land. And the argument was very understandable. We had moved from the 19th, 18th century when land was important to the 20th century when manufacturing land was no longer important. So that's why we put out land from our models. But even then, we should have realized that GDP, a quarter of GDP, is housing. And an important part of housing is land values. And when you see the rise in the real estate bubble that Thomas pointed out, it's not the construction cost that's going up. The construction cost is basically a very elastic supply industry. It's the value of land that's implicit in that. Now, from a technical point of view, and I can't go into this, the real problem with land is that the value of the land has to be solved with respect to the value next period and then the period after. That gives rise to an infinite period dynamic programming problem. There is no natural market solution to the transversality conditions, the boundary conditions, and it's therefore natural in a capitalist system that you get this kind of dynamic instability, which can lead to bubbles, which then crash. And in that period, wealth looks like it's going up, but of course, that growth in wealth can actually impede the accumulation of real capital. And so the wealth of the economy, as really measured, goes down. My time is running out, so let me just make two other important points. One of them is, if you take this view that I try to put forward, that it's about the underlying institutions, the rules of the game, the whole set of laws going and institutions, from the way the central bank behaves, the way our corporate governance, our antitrust laws, our union, our education system. If you take that view of what is driving the growth of inequality, one has to come to the conclusion that minor tweaks in the economic system are not going to solve the problem. Yes, it's important to improve our education system and increase educational opportunity. Yes, it's important to improve minimum wages. These will make a big difference, but they won't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the whole structure of our economy, which has been oriented more at increasing rents than increasing productivity and real economic growth that would be widely shared in our society. The second thing is that there are actually a lot of policies that one should think about, but one has to always think about issues of shifting, so that, for instance, just a tax on capital might be shifted. In a lot of the models that we write down, that would happen. But a tax on land, rents, would actually address some of the underlying problems. This is an idea that Henry George had more than 100 years ago, But the analysis that I've done and says it actually goes one step beyond Henry George. Henry George argued for a land tax because it was non-distortionary. But this analysis says that a land tax actually improves the productivity of the economy because you encourage people to invest in productive capital rather than into rent-generating wealth. And the result of that shift in the composition of savings towards more productive investment leads to a more productive economy, and in the end leads to a more equal society. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very conscious that this is the opening session and that our speakers tonight have shared very generously with us their time and described their key themes to us very clearly and succinctly. So I'm going to bypass the questions from the floor tonight. I'm going to, however, use my prerogative as the chairman of this session to instead direct one or two questions myself to Thomas and to Joe, and hopefully have convened or channeled the spirit of the group towards them, if I can. I'd like to ask Joe, if I could, you started there when you said earlier that you named the book that you'd recently written, The Price of Inequality, that it was now quite clear that we paid a price in growth terms. Can we get to the point, do you think, and what work do we need to do further to be able to prove that incontrovertibly so that policymakers begin to take this question of inequality more seriously as they see it as an impediment to growth?
Well, as in other areas, I think the key research challenge is to try to parse out more clearly the channels by which this works. And we understand several of the channels. For instance, one of them was highlighted by the data that Thomas put up. If poor children of poor parents, don't have the chance to go to college, they're not going to live up to their full opportunity. So in a sense, you're wasting your most valuable resource, your human resource. So that a whole set of channels linked to the failure to use your resources, your human resources, effectively. Part of the analysis is based on an analysis of the relationship between inequality and instability, and inequality and lack of growth. So this is the basic idea that if you go back to the Great Recession, one of the arguments that I put forward in my book Freefall, and the commission that some people here were on that looked at the crisis, emphasized that people at the top spend a smaller fraction of their income than people at the bottom. In fact, the people at the bottom in the United States were spending 110% of their income. What does that mean? If you transfer money from the bottom to the top, aggregate demand goes down. There's therefore a tendency, not an inevitability, but a tendency for central banks to respond myopically and say, okay, aggregate demand is weak. What do we do about it? We lower interest rates, make regulations lax, and that creates a bubble, and that bubble then creates instability, and when it breaks, the economy is in a mess. So there's a real association between this problem of lack of demand and instability. A lot of this has to do with political economy, I think, because when you have a lot of inequality, especially in a country like America where economic inequality translates into political inequality, you have incentives to pass laws that actually first of all, you don't have incentives to make the public investments that would make the economy more productive. You saw some of the charts that Thomas put about the level of public capital. That is symptomatic that we're not investing in ways that would lead to increase in productivity. The percentage of GDP that we're investing in basic research now in the United States is lower than it was 50 years ago. Infrastructure, anybody that goes into New York knows that we have a lack of infrastructure. So the problem is that when you have a lot of inequality, there is a concern on many people's part. They want the government to be as small as possible because they don't want it to be taxed. And they don't want to be taxed. And the lack of ability to get a consensus over necessary public investments and the impetus to have deregulation measures that lead to the kind of excesses that we saw, those two combined can lead both to lower average performance and more instability. So to answer your question in brief, it really is a research program that I think has to focus on the various channels by which this poor performance gets manifested.
Most of us start any inquiry with some sense of a worldview. We then try to be as open-minded and inquiring as we can, but that worldview always needs to be dealt with. Thomas, your book arrived like a hand grenade, and I'm just interested in the experience you've had in dealing with doubters, in talking to people within the economics profession and indeed outside of it, policymakers and politicians, about the key findings in your book. Have you been able to persuade anyone whose worldview was already set in a totally different direction?
Yes, that's a difficult part. You know, a problem in particular, you know, sometimes economists, it's not only that they don't, some of them write books, but many of them don't write books anymore. But the main problem is that many of them don't read books anymore either. So that makes it difficult. You know, there's not much I can do for people who don't read books. So this is, but you know, by and large, you know, my experience is that in fact many people in the world, you know, many economists of course, but also many people outside economics, the economics profession, have a strong appetite, you know, for more economic knowledge and for, you know, I think what the main lesson I have drawn from the going all over the world for the promotion of my book is that you have many different people, young and old, and outside the economics profession who are tired to hear that this is too complicated for them, that economic and financial issues can be understood only by a small group of experts who have developed a science that is so sophisticated that nobody else can understand. And of course, this is a big joke, and economists have contributed to this big joke. But this, you know, I see that there is a strong demand for some form of democratization of economic knowledge. And you know, in the end, this makes me a bit more optimistic because I think, you know, people want to make their own opinion, and I think by having more studies on the different mechanisms that generate inequality, the consequences of inequality for unequal access to education, to assets, to property, to political influence, to information, to the media, you know, in the end can make a difference. So, you know, I think many people in the end look at the evidence, and many people are surprised to learn that we've had, for instance, you know, this very high top tax rate in the past, and, you know, apparently this did not destroy American capitalism, and if anything, again, productivity growth rate were higher than what they've been in recent decades. You know, my experience is that you know, knowledge and better knowledge can change these lines of discussion sometime. But you know, of course, many people are not ready for a quiet debate on this, but many people are.
Well, if you machine gun them with the statistics you used tonight, I could see it would be very effective. And then finally, just a question for both of you, if I could. What do you think remains the most contentious? Where is there most consensus amongst economists? Is it about the causes of inequality or about the cure? Joe?
I think on the basic facts of the growth of inequality, I think there's broad consensus. There's a little bit of debate about what is the right adjustment for public transfers. How do you adjust for, you know, the transfers in kind in particular? But the overall data, I think, is so compelling that while there are a few doubters, on the what has happened, I think there's broad consensus. I think that there was a view until about 2000. There was a little bit of a debate about whether the inequality in the labor was driven by skill-biased technical change. That debate, I think, is mostly over now, and even the proponents of that view have said, look at what has happened since 2000 can't be explained by skill bias technical change, because even the skilled people are doing very badly. So I think that's while there's not an agreement about what is going on, there's agreement that that skill bias explanation that played a very big role has changed. Globalization is the new area where I think there's a lot of debate. While it can't explain why the U.S. is worse than so many other countries, it's a global phenomena. The fact that there more recent studies have shown that those counties, those areas in the United States that have been more impacted by surges of imports have had their wages go down and unemployment go up is a real challenge to the competitive equilibrium model that economists love so much. Because it says evidently there are big adjustment problems. And it reminds us that economies don't necessarily quickly adjust to the circumstance, to shocks, and that these can last for a very long time. I suppose the most controversial element is on the issue of what we can do, how far will the reforms in the legal structures I talked about, corporate governance, antitrust, will that really make a profound effect, or is that just addressing an important issue but not really change the underlying? And the other one is how adverse are the effects of tax policies that would be designed like more progressive income taxation. I'm of the view, very much like Thomas, that we could have much higher taxes without significant adverse effects. But I certainly think we could go from our regressive tax system to a progressive tax system. We could tax capital at the same rate that we do ordinary income, and that would be very beneficial for our economy. But those on the more conservative side continue to talk about job creators, as if there's a class of people up there that need to get the capital and it'll trickle down. I think among economists that view is not widely held, but you might call it the high elasticity view, that if you do anything, people respond strongly. That is still a view that is held by significant parts of the economics profession.
Thomas?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Joe just said. I think there's very little consensus about many of the solutions, and in particular about the level of tax progressivity for top income groups and top wealth groups. I think much of the economics profession still lives in the sort of post, let's say, Reagan-Feldstein consensus that, the lowering of top income tax rate to 30% or 35 or 40% was the best thing that ever happened to America and to the world. And
even though it hasn't shown up in any increase in
right,
growth.
but we're still, even so myself, as a graduate student and as a young assistant professor, I heard so much, this claim that, for instance, kind of argument that people still believe a lot is, well, at least, when you had, now when you have very low top tax rate, people, maybe they get a lot of cash, but they don't get all these perks and non-taxable benefits like fancy cars or fancy apartments that they used to get back in the old days of the 50s and 60s when you have very high tax rate. And for a long time, I was repeating, this kind of claim. And then I realized, looking at the data, that if anything, today you have, a lot of cash top compensation, but also a lot of perks. And if anything, they seem to be complementary rather than substitute. And if you look at very top compensation package, you have an increase both of, really excessive monetary compensation and, jet offices and everything that the non-taxable part as well. So, but I guess the profession, has played a big role in the, let's say, the Reagan-Feldstein 1980s change, and this is still very influential, not only at the NBER, but also in the profession in general. And if you think of wealth taxation and capital taxation, you know, when Bob Lucas got his Nobel Prize, he had this famous lecture on supply-side economics where he said, well, you know, the biggest thing that I have learned in economics is that the optimal tax rate on capital should be exactly 0%. You know, which is really small for a tax rate, you know, but so he didn't want 1% or 2%, 0%. And he said, you know, there is a theoretical model which tells me except that, you know, the only model where you get such a conclusion, basically, is a model either where you have no inherited wealth and pure life cycle wealth, no capital market imperfection, or a model where you have an infinite elasticity of capital supply in the long run. And of course, you know, you should never tax something that's infinitely elastic. But, you know, labor is also elastic. So you have cost for taxation, whether it's labor tax or capital tax, and you have to balance the two. But, you know, the economics profession has still still needs time to come to a more balanced view of the optimal tax system, and still lives very much into a pretty extreme view with very little labor income tax progressivity and very little or even zero capital tax. And this goes well beyond, you know, I had a debate recently with Mankiw, who was a chairman of the Bush Council of Economic Advisors, of course, was in favor of the complete repeal of the estate tax, which in the end was reintroduced. But, you know, this goes way beyond Lucas and Mankiw and Feldstein. This is still very strong in the profession.
Can I just comment on one point,
sir.
just to reemphasize, that they constructed models in which they built in the side the model the assumptions that gave them the results.
Right.
So you write down a model where you have infinite elasticity, and then you say the model shows there's a high elasticity. So, and then you say, with an infinite elasticity, the tax should be zero. So we didn't have to have the model to say that.
Exactly.
If you just began with the sayings, I'm going to begin and show you I can write down a model with infinite elasticity, and that tax would be zero, we could have said, yeah, you could do that, but you could also do a model that's more reasonable.
So Joe, your point there gives us the final jumping off point for this final minute as we end this, a mere 15 minutes late, which given our opening session is not too bad. Because Joe, you rumbled them on those models, and they have been rumbled. And that leads me to my final minute, which is simply to say, as a call to arms, as a plea to you, the economics profession, with so much now known, with so much now stipulated, with so much of the voodoo debunked, can we please have an interim model? Can we please have a unified, inclusive growth model that takes the benefits of what can be agreed, rests on the consensus that we've already got between members of the profession, and of course leaves room for continuing debate and research around the sides of that. But if there's already a certain amount of agreement on things which could be pooled, unified, stratified, and begun to be shared with policymakers and others that will plan our growth, a probable low growth decade, as we look at the next 10 years, then can we get that into their hands as soon as possible, an interim unified model, relying on what we have already been able to see over the last 10, 20, and 30 years. You know, there's a phrase that Sigmund Freud used. It was the phrase, the vanity of small differences. And I fear the vanity of small differences. I'm not an economist, I'm a progressive. I'm allowed to be nakedly, unashamedly partisan on behalf of poor people. And when I look at the failure of other progressives and other progressive movements over the last 100 years, I see the vanity of small differences at work on the political sphere. And in that political sphere, in fact, this very city in 1899, the beginning of the last century, had the Second International, a group of people who came together, coalesced a number of things which were achievements they wanted to see happen for working people everywhere, and then spent the next 50 years arguing about how to do that. Let's not do that as we look at the next 10 years in the economics profession. What can be known, what consensus can be lent on, what can be unified and codified, we should get into the hands of those that run our countries and seek to strengthen our social democracies. Thank you for tonight's session. I'm sure you'll enjoy the next 2 days. Goodbye.
We'll see everyone tomorrow morning at the OECD
and we'll continue to set sail in this most interesting frontier. Thank you.